I thought winter would be empty. I was wrong. It was watched. The wind came off the ridge like a door being slammed, a hard white sound that erased the edges of the world. I had been walking the old game trail out of habit more than necessity, boots sinking in the soft drift, pack heavy with extra blankets and a can of coffee. The light was flat, and the sky had the color of old tin. Then, half hidden against a drift that had stacked itself against a fallen pine, I saw the shape. Not quite a body, not quite a thing, angled as if it had been folded and left. Something in the way the snow laid across it told me it had been there a while. It was not human. That truth arrived before the questions. The chest had a blackened patch, like a burn that had eaten at whatever skin lay beneath. One hand showed, long, but not long the way a raccoon's is long in an odd, deliberate geometry. 3 fingers curled around a shard of something that might have been metal or might have been bone. The fingers, pale but not pink like wet pewter, had knuckles that might have been joint or might have been armor. When I crouched, the wind flayed in my face and the wind smelled of cold iron and spruce. The thing, person, shifted. I heard a low, ragged sound, and I thought of a wounded elk or a trapped coyote. The practical part of my brain took over. Get it out of the weather, get it warm, stop the bleeding. I wrapped it in my extra wool blanket and carried it the 3 hours back to the cabin. The path that had been a clear line home in summer had become a soft, uncertain fault. Snow slid from the pines in quiet avalanches, and my breath came in short white puffs. At 63, my knees are the first to complain, and my hands remembered every small bruise and steering decision. I had been a park ranger long enough to know how things look when life is hurt, the way the head tilts, the way a paw tucks. I had been a ranger long enough to bring the injured into the shed and try to make the world right again. The cabin smelled of stove smoke and old cedar, of coffee grounds and the remains of a radio program that I only ever heard pieces of. I put the thing on the table near the wood stove and stripped frost from its surface with a clean rag. Its skin, if that's what to call it, was warm in an uneven way, like a patchwork of hot and cold stones. The burn on its chest was an angry black bloom. The edges of whatever fabric it had been wearing, if it was wearing a fabric, were fused in a way that suggested more than heat. I prodded gently with a cloth. The wound resisted, as if whatever lay beneath didn't want to be touched. It drank when I offered water. I had seen animals lap and seen children suck at a bottle, but this drinking was neither. The opening in its throat, there was no throat like ours, but an aperture that narrowed and widened, accepted water with an almost surgical efficiency. The animal inside it seemed to dissolve into need and then slump. It shivered in a way that suggested pain, and then, incredulously, a hand, 3 narrow fingers, found my wrist and pressed. It was a small, formal pressure, like a promise. I made a fire, warmed broths, cleaned the wound as carefully as my limited medical training allowed, and wrapped it in the spare blanket again. I had bandaged many things in the woods: a hunter's torn palm, a child's sprained ankle, a porcupine's quill turned into a lecture. This was not like those. The tools were the same: tincture, gauze, thread, but the responses were different. The stitches I thought of as stitches for a story I had never read. That night I did not sleep. You learn the rhythms of injury if you've lived alone long enough. You find the small intervals between breaths and let them pass you like fish. I sat by the stove, chewing the inside of my cheek, and watching the thin band of steam curl from a mug of coffee I kept more for the heat than the taste. The thing lay under the blanket, and I watched the rise and fall of its shoulders, trying to name it, to label it in the clean boxes my life had always used: male or female, animal or person, friend or danger. Names did not fit. It did not make a single sound for a long time. Once or twice, a soft clicking that might have been teeth, might have been some mechanism, slipped from it. At one point, as if pulled by some consideration I could not see, a finger, 3 of them, unwrapped the blanket edge and traced the carved top of my little kitchen table. The motion was careful, reverent almost, as if it were cataloging the grain of the wood, the small gouge I had put there years ago with a dull hatchet when the mind wandered. It stopped when its hand brushed the burn scar on my left palm. It looked. No, not looked. It touched. I felt whatever that contact meant as a small warmth, like a nudge. I did the practical work that keeps the imagination from doing the dangerous thing of inventing horrors. I boiled water and mixed a saline rinse. I cleaned the wound and bandaged it. I burned sage the way my grandmother used to, not for ritual, but because the smoke made a smell I could hold on to and measure against the strange odor that clung to my visitor. I asked questions aloud like a man who wants witnesses to his own decency. Are you hurt? Can you speak? What do you need? The voice that answered me did not belong to a throat or to my ears. It arrived inside my head in a pulse, an impression, sudden and compact, like the compression of a single word into a bell. Gratitude. Not a sentence, a thrust of something that tasted like a clean river. I swallowed a laugh that was half relief, half fear. I had never told anyone that I had kept a little box of postcards from when I was younger, images of mountains, fingerprints of the places I'd loved. They lay in the top drawer of my kitchen table, and later, when the fire had settled into coals, I slid one open and let the thing feel the paper.
Its fingers closed around the image of a lake in summer, and whatever passed between us then was private and immediate. It told me nothing in words after that first impression. That first impression was the size of an island. Afterward came smaller signals, fragments, quick shapes. They were not thoughts as I think of them, not sentences built on grammar. They were impressions, images, the way wind sketches the line of a dune. The first time one lit in my head, it was a map that breathed, lines of light, nodes, a sense of numbers moving like schools of fish. There was a cadence to these transmissions, a rhythm as old and patient as being observed. Observe, record, report. These were not words like apple or water. They were commands, or perhaps labels applied to what I was, the way an ecologist stamps a tag on a bird. They implied a process far larger than the two of us in a little stove-lit room. I set them aside in my head like stones, heavy and cold, and when sleep finally took me, it took me with the sound of wind behind the door and the image of those 3 fingers holding a postcard of a place the thing had never seen. The next morning, the wound had tightened overnight. The scorched area had a crust that flaked when I touched it. The thing drank broth offered gently from a chipped bowl. When I did not move for a while, it made that impression again, not gratitude so much as calculation, and then, at last, another wash of something more personal. I could not name it. It felt like an admission, like a folding inward. I have always been a man who believes in solitude as a place of clean thinking. The cabin is the place where the maps are in my head, the seasons are my calendar. 3 hours to the nearest village, a road that rarely saw cars in winter, a radio whose signals sometimes drifted in like a neighbor calling to say hello. I left public life by degrees, first the long hikes, then the official letters, until the ranger station seemed like a place of someone else's stories. The decision was simple on paper. I loved the ridge, the way the light hits the junipers in late afternoon, the way tracks tell you the story of a night. I liked listening to myself. Yet as I sat across from a being who seemed to catalog my mug, my spoon, my scar, I felt the peculiar sting of being recognized. There is a difference between being alone and being unobserved. The difference is how you behave when no one is looking. In solitude, I had told myself I was a kind of moral exemplar, honest to the small things, careful with the trust one has with the land. The thing's gaze, if the thing had a gaze, taught me there are other measures. For days, our life narrowed to small economies. I cut wood, kept the stove patient, mixed broths, and sat with the thing as if it were an old dog. It did not sleep like we do. It would render its body into intervals of rest where the breath would slow to the memory of a tide. Between rests, it would send small impressions, no louder than a pebble dropped in a pond. Sometimes I would feel very clearly, "We observe you as you observe us." The thought was not accusatory. It was, how to say it, recording every detail as a scientist records data. The way I kept my boots by the door, the way I washed the same mug every evening, the way I kept the little pile of letters tied with string in the top drawer. Every small choice slid into whatever catalog it kept. Once I broke. I had been thinking about a village kid I used to teach how to read a topo map, a boy who had shot himself on a dare with an old rifle. Memory can be a blunt instrument. I had promised to myself many times that I would speak up when danger came. I had not done so then. I found reasons that seemed good in my head, and reasons often look like truth when you are alone with them. The thing, feeling the tremor of that regret, sent me the impression not as language, but as an image, a scale, like an old handheld balance, tipping, tiny weights of days and choices stacked one on top of another. It is an odd thing to be weighed by a creature you do not understand. It is odder to find that in being weighed, you begin to weigh yourself differently. Weeks passed, and the wound closed a little more each day. The carbonated crust shed, and under it pink tissue glinted like the inside of a shell. Food intake changed, from broth to something more substantial. The thing showed a preference for boiled roots and a translucent paste that stiffened when cold. It took the tasks with patience, and every now and then a small, involuntary mimic of human motion, the way it turned a cup on its heel, the way it folded its hands in its blanket. Those moments, the mimicry, were like honesty. In them, the distance between us contracted. It started to watch me the way I'd watched a newborn fox learn to hunt, with a kind of careful, clinical curiosity that nevertheless softened as time passed. I, in turn, began to watch the visitor in ways I had not watched another person in years. I cataloged its little rituals, the way it spent long minutes staring at the knot in the kitchen table as if it were an object of worship, the way it would sometimes hum, more like a vibration, when the stove flame curled in on itself. In that hum was a tone that felt like homesickness and also like recording. I began to wonder if I was the subject of study not because I had sheltered the thing, but because my kind of quiet made it easier to see the bones of a man, the choices we make without an audience. At odd hours, the impressions came stronger. They were not words, but images, a ring of lights in a dark sky, a crowded space of entities, a sense of debate that moved like the shifting of weather. Once the number pressed into me as a weight, 1,200, and I felt the impression of voices, not words, but positions, like currents in a river. We are not alone in looking, it seemed to say.
When I pressed for anything resembling specifics, when I asked the only questions that nagged at the edges of sanity, who, why, how long, the answers always came wrapped in that compressed, telegraphic way. They were blunt as a stone and efficient as a trap. The impressions would come. Observers, active, 1,200, watch, debate. I asked because a man in an isolated cabin who has seen too many seasons without much company asks ridiculous things of the universe. Do they decide things? Do they decide us? The response was a pattern of images this time. Scales again, then a dark hinge, then a small sound like a clock unspooling. Time, generations, a suggestion of a vote to come. But even in this hint there was a hesitance that surprised me. If these beings could somehow reach across the blackness between us and plant an impression in my skull, they could simply tell me what they wanted. Instead, there was a debate, and the debate was messy and human-sounding in its divisions. You must understand how that landed on me. I had always thought of being looked at as a metaphor, surveillance cameras, radio transmissions. This was literal in a way I had not wanted to believe. The world had moved from a man and a stranger in a cabin to a stage watched by a chorus of minds weighing evidence. The idea that the fate of my species could be talked of in rooms of observers, consulted like a board evaluating a failing company, did what all such notions do. It made the moral calculus personal. If they were deciding in quiet rooms whether humanity gets to continue as before, then my small choices might matter more than I had given them credit for. The scales the thing had shown me were not just metaphors. They were a way of measuring aggregate behavior. I remember the cold evening when the visitor first described why isolates mattered. The stove hissed and the pot rimmed with steam as I stirred. Outside, the ridge's profile was a dark tooth against the sky. The thing lay on the bench, trunk supported with stacked blankets, head turned toward me. It sent the impression in a slow, measured stream. Isolate, reveal, came first. See the shape of being when the audience is gone. The message was clear and blunt. In solitude, the things you are, unperformed, show themselves.
In the same burst came another weight, the idea that privacy could harbor either saint or scoundrel, and that the ratio between them could tilt the course of civilization. I did not know whether to feel insulted or absolved. There was a memory in me of many small choices, the time I left a sledder to his own devices because I judged him proud enough to demand rescue, the times I read reports and muttered that the mountain would teach its own lessons. I had always told myself that stepping back is a kind of respect, let people learn. But if absence is a factor that allows harm to accumulate, then absence may also be an abdication. The thing did not moralize.
It painted models, a village that tended its own, a city that let strangers do as they pleased. The impressions were neat because they were computations, nothing like the messy human stories that make up a life, but they had consequences. Then, in a movement that felt like an apology or perhaps a confession, the visitors sensed something else, smaller, almost private. We change as you change us. That notion caught me off guard. I had assumed that observation is a unilateral act. One watches, the other is watched. Here, the watcher admitted to being affected. It had held my hand and felt the scar. It had listened to my muttered justifications while we repaired its wound. It had catalogued in its own way and found something unexpected, the capacity of the observed to alter the observer. It is a small mercy to be able to change the mind of someone who holds your future in their hands. There were other small things. It mimicked the way I held my coffee mug, and then, without explanation, imitated my crooked whistle when I called the stove to keep the embers bright. It seemed to flinch the first time I cursed at a memory of a town meeting, and later, when I corrected my speech, it absorbed the correction. Its impressions switched from cold data to scattered personal images. My father's hands, the white scar on my knee from falling off a ridge when I was a boy, the time my wife left without explanation 20 years before I considered the cabin my home. Each artifact of my past slid into whatever counting device the thing had inside it, not as an accusation, but as a color on a long palette.
The images suggested urgency, a vote within the span of a few generations, a decisive meeting within 2 generations perhaps, and a window for influence that stretched, in their terms, 3 to 5 generations. It was not a calendar that fitted neatly into my life. It was a lever that belonged to the long game. I asked why isolates study. The impression that responded was blunt. Isolates reveal how the species acts when it thinks there is no witness. The traveler, for lack of a better word, said this in the same spare way. There was no haughtiness in it, only a function. But the functional tone hid an ethical struggle. The thing gave me images of rooms where other observers argued in waves. Some kept to strict refusal, others to gentle correction, and some to direct action. I felt the shape of argument in the impressions, positions laid out like cards on a table, each with numbers stuck to them. I could not make sense of the stakes beyond the sense that they are enormous. A question that had been curled inside me like a sleeping wolf unfurled its teeth. If I, a man who chose solitude, am part of the data pool, what does that make my choices? Are they noble acts of withdrawal? Acts of cowardice? What matter did my silence keep? The visitor never judged me aloud. It only presented patterns and watched my face for the reaction. In time, the act of being watched made me watch myself differently. I tightened the screws on my own excuses. At some point, not long after it began to walk again with the supportive crutches I fashioned from a sapling, the visitor surprised me. It reached out, not the careful probe in the beginning, but a full extension, and touched my face. The pressure was nothing. The impression was everything. We do not desire to govern. We do not relish taking. We worry, if you will, the impression said. There was a grief there that was not alien in feeling. It suggested a committee with a conscience and a friction that felt painfully familiar, the way humans argue over one another's fates. I could feel my own defensiveness rise. You think I would be defensive, I suppose. I told it so one afternoon when the storm outside had softened into a steady sigh, and the light from the stove painted the cabin in an ochre that felt almost like home. I argued, aloud, in the most human way. Who are they to weigh us? Are we not the ones who live and die by loving and failing, by making messy decisions that no outsider could truly weigh? The answer I received was not a bald dismissal. It was an image of me stacking firewood, scraping the ice off the window, writing a short note and tucking it into an envelope I had long meant to send. It looked less like judgment and more like noticing. The thing's impression was, you matter because you choose. It was simple and terrifying. I want to be clear, there was no sermon, no apocalyptic pronouncement. The visitor was not a prophet.
It was an emissary of attention.
That attention, however, came with consequences. The more it noticed, the more it cataloged. The more it cataloged, the richer the debate it would feed back to whatever chorus watched us both. And I began to realize the terrifyingly ordinary possibility that our private lives, multiplied, might look like a map of where kindness ends and neglect begins. When the visitor finally tried to stand without leaning and walked into the clearing of white beyond my threshold, I felt both pride and a strange melancholy. Every small act of care had been a test for someone or something else. It had made me more generous than I had been in years, and for that I found myself strangely glad. But there was an ache in being part of data. There is a dignity in being human that is not about what other people can see, but about how you learn to forgive yourself for lying about your best intentions. There were nights I woke and found the visitor sitting upright, its 3 fingers folded into each other, an emotion I had come to understand as thought. It sent an impression then that stuck with me. Mutual. The watchers change when watched. I had assumed that being observed was a cost the observed must pay. Here, in the round of our small cabin, the visitor made it clear the ledger is double-sided. I learned slowly to ask better questions. I wanted to know how many watchers there were, and one night that number came like a stone skipping across a wide lake. 1,200. The figure did not come with names or titles, only with presence. So many active voices paying accounts. The sensation that accompanied the number was not triumphant. It was heavy, like the weight of many hands laid on a table. I found the weight both terrifying and strangely calming. There were ways to be comforted by the idea that someone, somewhere, keeps an inventory of our small acts. There were ways to feel violated by it too. When I pushed for motive, the responses waned into smaller pieces I could not quite stitch into a whole. The visitor would send impressions. Observe, calculate, debate, protect we cannot always, intervene we may if thresholds pass. The images sketched a moral architecture with rooms I could only scope like a man seeing the skeleton of a house through a wall. There was a sense that the watchers feared a human future, where the capacity for harm multiplied faster than the capacity for repair. There was the suggestion, too, that some among them found our autonomy too beautiful to tamper with, that others feared the potential for self-destruction and leaned toward more controlling remedies. I felt, as these impressions arrived, the old ranger in me waking up in a new way. There are things you learn on the trail, to notice subtle shifts in behavior, to take an early action so a small wound doesn't become a mortal one. What surprised me was not the visitor's cataloging, but my own reaction. I felt unexpectedly, and in some ways uncomfortably, beholden.
Not to the watchers, but to the notion that my choices might tilt a distant balance. A man alone with a stove and a stranger begins to feel like a weather station whose logs might steer a storm. At the same time, I recognized something more tender and more dangerous. The visitors themselves were not monolithic. There were moments when the one across from me seemed almost childish in curiosity, other moments when it demonstrated an institutional coldness I could not warm. The evidence of internal conflict inside those impressions suggested that whatever was watching was as fraught as any human council, full of divisions, prejudices, and cautious hope. If there was a moral to the first weeks of our encounter, it was this: kindness matters, even when it is observed, not because observation was the only reason to be kind, but because observation forces the truth of habit. If you act kindly only to be seen, the act is brittle. If you act kindly when no one can see you, you are practicing something steadier. The visitor's presence sharpened that realization into a kind of urgency. On one of the clearer evenings, when the moon cut the snow into white plates and the wind was a soft hum, the thing sent an image that lodged like a splinter. It was not a number or a map, but a simple scene. A town lit at dusk, a group of people in a square where one man refused to help another, a chain of small refusals building like dry kindling. The impression was straightforward. Threshold. If enough small things go unchecked, we move into a different category of being. The danger implied did not have the melodramatic edges popular culture gives to such notions. It was granular. Budgets of compassion going unpaid, social nets fraying, choices that pile up until the fabric is not fabric anymore. I felt then something heavier than fear: responsibility. It is a sober and intimate thing to realize that your private acts are not private. The visitor had shown me the fold between me and the rest of us. It had, in its own way, taught me that to be isolated is not always to be pure. There can be an ugliness to withdrawing. There is also a holiness to staying. That night, I sat at the table and wrote a letter I had avoided for years. I wrote to a town I had once served, and in which a man had died on an offhand decision I had not had the courage to challenge. The letter was not a confession in the way people think of confessions. It was an admission and an offer to return to speak something true. I tied the envelope with string and placed it in a drawer. The visitor watched my clumsy gestures and sent me, like a benediction, the single impression I understood as approval. If I tell you this, it's not to claim I have been absolved. The story is not moral instruction in tidy packages. It is testimony of a night when a man found himself watched, and in being watched, awakened to a new sense of measure. The mountain did not become less cold.
The world did not suddenly rearranged into a kindness factory, but I began, in small ways, to move differently. I shoveled paths more often for neighbors who might come in from the road. I answered a call on a weak radio. I left a note in a mailbox in a town I hardly visited, and felt, as dangerous as it sounds, like an actor stepping on stage after a long rehearsal. There were nights when the impressions grew darker and complicated. The visitor would catalog histories, places where a species had been allowed to teeter, the ways outsider hands had intervened or not, and it would send me snapshots that did not aim to terrify, but to instruct. It showed me how an aggregate of private choices became public consequence. The mathematics of it was simple when stripped to its bones. Behaviors accumulate, cultures are sums. On a morning when the frost rhymed the window with lace and the sky promised thaw, the visitor sent two new impressions in quick succession: vote, generation. The feel of those two words together was electric. Again, I was given no names and no sworn oaths, only the sense that a group, many-headed, would at some time render a kind of judgment about human autonomy. I felt my pulse quicken and then slow, like a clock correcting itself. My hands, which had hurt from chopping wood and from the repetitive motions of bandaging, steadied. The thought of a vote beyond my lifetime did not relieve me, it anchored me. If a fate was to be decided in a scale measured in generations, then the weight of my choices now mattered as a thread in a larger weave. I do not mean to make this sound more cosmic than it is. It is not angelic intervention nor a monstrous conspiracy. The visitor made no claim of absolute power for those who watched. It described a debate, a plurality. It hinted at arguments and cautions, at a reluctance to override, at the scariness of taking the agency from a species. What it conveyed, repeatedly, was nuance. And yet nuance did little to settle the unease. If strangers across a gulf could watch and weigh and discuss, then the quiet life I had chosen felt suddenly like a choice with consequences I had not properly imagined. When someone watches you, they see the corners you leave unlit. They see the petty faults you let slide. They see the ways in which a man can justify absence until it becomes a policy. I had to confront the small betrayals I had let pile up as if they weren't matters of public significance. For the first stretch of the encounter, then, our life was a rehearsed intimacy. I tended to it as I would tend an injured settlement. I mended the parts that were mendable and collected data of my own. I began to think in new ways about community. The visitor taught me by not teaching. It offered images, numbers, impressions like pebbles thrown into the pond. The ripples were mine to read. But there are questions that cannot be avoided forever. The more the visitor recovered, the more it became restless.
It would stand at the door and face the white slope, as if it could read the stories that the snow told. Sometimes it would hold my hand and, in a way that looked like blessing, place its 3 fingers over my knuckles. Its touch was an old thing to which I had no ready argument, part gratitude, part plea. I felt the pressure of the gesture like an anchor. The storm would not last forever, and neither would our fragile arrangement. When at last it moved with the steady gait of something healed enough to go, it sent a last small impression that was more intimate than the rest. You have been observed and recorded. You have been seen. The implication was not of a verdict yet, only of a path opened. I did not realize then how that path would fork in my chest. I thought that after it left, the quiet of the cabin would return. I thought the visitor would become a memory I could fold into the drawer with the postcards. I was wrong about that too. Something had shifted, subtle and inexorable, like the displacement of a tectonic plate. I found myself walking into the village more, leaving notes, attending a meeting.
I found my ears aching for other people's voices. The rupture of habit is not always dramatic. Often it is the accumulation of small acts, like the way rain shapes a riverbed. But the story is not finished. There is a meeting ahead of which I have only half the details. There is an idea of votes and voices. There is a weight of numbers, an urgency of generations. The thing that left my cabin took with it a small part of me and left behind questions that sit heavy on the table like a mug of unwarmed coffee. The valley outside will melt in due time, and thaw will show whatever is buried under the white. For now, there is only the small work of returning to the town, picking up a life in public view, and the peculiar knowledge that the private acts I had once treated as unimportant might be ledger entries in a far wider account. If this story is touching something awake in you, an urge to live with purpose, to let private choices line up with public good, then stay with me. Subscribe and check the pinned comment for a small free ebook I put together about rebuilding the small habits that matter most. It is not a promise of salvation, it is a set of tools I have found useful. If nothing else, the idea that my little changes mattered to a visitor who recorded them taught me that habit is a kind of testimony.
I asked because the only thing a man in a doorway will do when given a list is ask how it matters. The reply was a single impression, brief and mournful, and very human in its tone. The debate is about whether autonomy can survive rising harm. They weigh the aggregate of small acts. Those words, or images of words, landed differently than any sermon I had once heard. It had the bluntness of a ledger and the sorrow of a parent watching a child learn by falling. The visitor did not try to persuade me toward any faction. It offered the layout and the probabilities. I could have walked after it then, shut the door, and folded the story into a drawer with the postcards. Instead, I found myself asking one more question, not because I sought proof, but because the matter had become painfully intimate. Are votes announced? The answer came like a shutter closing slowly. Not always. Sometimes. Unpredictable. There was an undertone that I could not read as anything other than a warning. The impression stressed contingency. The watchers did not promise intervention. They argued about intervention. That made the possibility more urgent, not less. If decisions could be implemented without fanfare, if something as simple as a quiet removing of capability or a subtle nudge could happen in a way that never made headlines, then the most important battlefield might be the small, private habits people kept. When it released my hand, the gesture left me hollow and awake in a way I had not felt since my wife's leaving, something like a low hum beneath the chest. The visitor stepped away, looked once more at the knot in my table, as if filing that image into whatever archive had been collecting mine, and then walked down the slope. Its prints marched away in a neat, regular line. I watched until they were nothing but dim crescents on the wound of the hill, then went back inside and shut the door with hands that trembled more from a new sort of responsibility than from cold. After it left, there was silence that felt thicker than any wind. I stoked the stove slowly and let the sound of the fire fill the room like an answer. The postcards were in the drawer where I had left them. The letter to the town sat there tied with string. The world had not altered in visible ways. No lights in the sky, no emissaries arriving in suits, but a private hinge had turned inside me. In the days that followed, I tried to count what had changed. The visitor had been explicit enough for my purposes. The watchers were not a single tyrant. They were a chorus of minds, about 1,200 active voices, with a clear split. Roughly 30%, the non-intervention faction, argued on principle. Autonomy is a sacred right. To override agency is to commit a moral violence of its own. They reasoned that people must keep the capacity to fail and to heal, even when the cost is large.
The 45% favored what I would call guided intervention, small, calibrated nudges, corrections that preserved self-determination while steering away from catastrophe. They argued for restraint, but not for passivity. The remaining 25%, heavy with fear and blunt in logic, argued for direct intervention when thresholds were crossed, removing or limiting capabilities they judged to be dangerous, a programmatic reduction of capacity if the model suggested it necessary. Those positions felt less like arcane academic disputes and more like the kinds of arguments I had listened to at countless town meetings. There they concerned zoning or budgets. Here they concerned the capacity of a species to injure or to heal. The visitor had presented them not as declarations, but as data points. The percentages were precise enough to be meaningful and vague enough that I could see the argument in each. I found myself understanding the moral pull of every faction. I also found I could not stomach the cold arithmetic that reduced lives to columns in a ledger without feeling the messy human stories behind them. Part of what made the debate agonizing was the image the visitor had shown me repeatedly: a town at dusk, a line of small refusals, a social net with a couple of patched holes that became a gash when no one bothered to sew. The calculations the watchers ran were not about dramatic scenes of violence. They were about attrition. One refusal here, one neglect there, 1,000 small withdrawals from the civic life that once patched its own holes, and a culture shifts into a different shape. The watchers, by their own account, were especially attentive to isolates because isolating behavior narrows exposure to corrective social forces. There was a statistic, an impression the visitor had dropped once like a small stone, that stayed with me. In their models, roughly 40% of isolated cases exhibited patterns the watchers labeled reliably constructive, people who used solitude to create, to reflect, to tend. The rest were ambiguous. Some were neutral, some leaned toward harm by omission. That ambiguity, the visitor said in images, was the source of the dispute. How many ambiguous cases tilt into harm? How many constructive isolates counterbalance those that do not? The watchers crunched numbers. They modeled networks. I, with my battered hands in my woodpile, had become part of those models simply by living a certain way. It is an intimate thing to learn you are part of a dataset. It is a stranger thing to feel as if your life, untelevised and unadvertised, might be counted toward a civilizational fate. I found that the knowledge did not make me guiltless. It made me careful. It did not absolve my past passivity. It sharpened an old regret into something actionable. So I began to act in small, awkward ways. I left the letter in the drawer, no longer a draft, but a mission.
I took a slow walk to the village, not in a dramatic march, but in steps that felt like a muffled promise. On the road, I met a man carrying a flat tire, an older woman whose cart had broken. I helped with the tire and set the cart right. These were not grand gestures. They were the same acts of practical kindness I had performed in the ranger station a decade before, the same small stitches that, in the visitor's language, could add to a fabric of repair. When the thaw came and the roads opened enough for me to risk going to a town meeting, I went. The meeting was about expanding a small volunteer search and rescue program and about the state of a bridge that had been patched twice and patched again. There were 40 or so of us in the room. My voice quavered at first as I told a story about a boy I had taught years ago and a decision I had not then had the courage to make. I spoke not to repent theatrically, but to offer one practical thing. I would volunteer to help coordinate scheduled patrols for the ridge, to show up on days when winter left tracks, and to make sure someone knew to look for those tracks. A woman across the table nodded in a way that told me she recognized the truth of a man trying not to be a ghost. It was an ordinary exchange, letters handled, coffee drunk afterward, but it felt like a small alignment of will. In the weeks that followed, I began doing the kinds of things I used to do without thinking, checking a radio at odd hours, offering to clear an elderly neighbor's walk, showing up at a community meeting and listening more than talking. The change was less heroic than I had imagined. It was mostly the dull persistence of habit corrected. People noticed in small ways. The woman who ran the post office waved with a relieved tilt to her head. The neighbor whose cart I had helped thanked me, and then asked if I could be part of a rotating schedule to check on the valley's less visible corners. At times the gratitude made me ashamed, because it felt like a reward for something basic rather than heroic. At other times it steadied me, because it meant I had stepped into a mode where my life's small acts were no longer invisible to anyone who had once counted me a fixture of solitude. The visitor had told me that the watchers record more than the act itself. They record context, the reasons, the adjacent choices, the culture that made the act possible or impossible. That made me think about structural questions I had avoided with a proud sort of obliviousness. When people withdraw, why do they withdraw? What institutional or relational failures make isolation the default rather than a chosen refuge? The answer was not that simple. There are things human systems do poorly: a lack of generous time, stunted civic rituals, economies that prize extraction over care. I could not fix all that from my cabin, but I could refuse to be part of the withdrawing pattern. I could be one more person who showed up.
For all the practical changes, the inner work mattered most. The visitor's imprint on me was not just information, it was a moral exigency. In the cold nights after it left, I practiced a sort of inventory. Each evening, I set a small list in front of me. One thing I missed, one person I could call, one practical help I could offer. The list was trivial: write a letter, shovel a walk, check the radio, but the act of naming them made them more likely to occur. The watchers had given me no magic. It had given me accountability by making me visible to a mind beyond me. I chose to translate that visibility into self-accounting. At least once, I thought I saw a trace of the visitor. On a walk along the ridge, I noticed 3 neat, shallow impressions in the snow that matched the step the visitor had taken. They were old and softened by sun, but for a moment I felt the old shock. I pressed my gloved hand to the snow beside a print and felt a warmth rise like a suggestion. Whether that was fancy or residue, I do not know, but something of its presence lingered, as if a brass bell had been rung softly and the tone continued. Another thing the visitor had made clear, and which I learned to accept with little more comfort each time I considered it, was that the watchers themselves are changed by what they see. The impression that had lodged like a splinter, the one that said, "We change as you change us," was not a sentimental aside. It was a statement of method. The visitor had taken my scarred hands and my small acts into its memory, and, I had the sense, found in them a pattern of stubborn, ordinary repair that complicated the models it had been given. It had not been neutral in the ledger. It had been affected by my life. In turn, that life was affected by knowing that fact. That mutuality made the debate among those 1,200 voices harder to grope. If the watchers were not monolithic, then their decisions would carry elements of their own biases and transformations. Some of them, the visitor suggested in small images, had been advocates for long enough that their positions hardened into dogma. Others shifted with new data. The visitor's own discomfort at the thought of direct intervention was, I felt, part of the chorus that leaned toward restraint. This is why the split was not merely a mathematical curiosity. It was the moral condition of citizens of a universe that sometimes counted human lives like measurements and sometimes like stories. Once, when I allowed myself an indulgence of memory, I thought of the time a hunter with a bad wound arrived at the ranger station years ago and how the station had rallied with a strange and specific grace. Hands had sewn, radios had called for directions, someone had driven a truck in a storm. That memory weighed against other times when townspeople had looked away because the problem did not touch them directly.
I thought of my own choices then, both the action and the inaction, and realized that the watchers, if they existed, would see every instance, every choice folded into a pattern. They would notice not only rescue, but willingness to risk the rescue. My life after the visitor's leaving was not uniformly noble. There were days when the old habit of shutting the world out crept in, and I would find myself again at the table with a mug cooling in my hand and the postcards tucked in a drawer. The temptation to believe the watchers would only count the loud things and not the small failures was a seduction of the lazy sort. I resisted it more successfully because the visitor had made those failures visible to me. Accountability, even self-imposed, is sometimes the most practical tool we have. Time moved in small, habitual increments. The winter thawed into a strip of dirty snow and then into mud, the way any season uncoils from its tough shell if you wait. Months after the visitor left, a letter arrived at my cabin, slipped beneath the door, with no return address. It was short and written in a small, neat hand. Inside, a single sentence. "Thank you for showing up." That small note, anonymous and ordinary, carried more weight than any thunderous pronouncement. It was a symptom of something the visitor had suggested. The fabric of a community is mended by small stitches. Not long after that, I received a call on the radio about a boy lost on the lower ridge. It was a night with a wind that set the pines whirling and a temperature drop that made the skin ache. I pulled on gear and walked toward the ridge, not because I believed it would change the fate of billions, but because the habit of rescue is exactly the sort of action that, if multiplied, shifts a culture. We found the boy shivering, scared but alive. His mother cried like someone who had been given back a small miracle. I did not tell her about watchers or votes. I handed her a warm blanket and a thermos of soup. I will not pretend that these acts erased a cosmic ledger. I do not know if they will tilt the scales in any model. What they did was alter the texture of my days. They changed how I heard the quiet. They made the notion of being counted less abstract and more urgent. That, perhaps, is the difference between living like a recorded specimen and living like a creature who knows the ripple of each footstep. The visitor's warning about unannounced votes recurs like a low refrain in my private thinking. It was not a threat so much as an explanation of possibility. Some among the watchers considered direct intervention a responsible option if their models suggested an uncontrollable trajectory. The visitor did not dress the idea in spectacle. It spoke of loss of capabilities, things that, quietly and without the theatrical, could alter a species' direction. I thought of rights quietly circumscribed, of inventions or capacities removed under the rationale of safety.
The possibility made the debate less theoretical. It made the need for civic courage sharper. I do not tell you these things to frighten you. I tell them because the fact that this story sits between us means we must choose how to act in its light. The narrative is not that a distant tribunal will simply decide our fate without our participation. The narrative is that the aggregate of our small acts matters, that there are minds who watch and who will judge, and that such judgment may be more about patterns than dramatic moments. I want to be clear about something else. When the visitor left, it left changed too. In the slow weeks after it departed, I sometimes felt the impression of its attention, like a warmth at the back of my skull. It had learned my petty decencies, my regrets, the small habits of a man who had been alone too long. If anything, that mutuality made the thought of being judged less abstract and more oddly intimate. To be counted by another consciousness, and in turn to affect that consciousness, that is a kind of reciprocity I had not expected to taste. There are practical details I must not leave out, because to omit them would be to let romance hide the grit. The visitors' models, the debates, the 1,200 voices, that is how my story was shaped. The three factions and their percentages, the 30% who value autonomy above intervention, the 45% pushing for calibrated nudges, and the 25% prepared to take direct measures, are facts as much as impressions in the way I receive them. The timeline was also put in dry terms. The window for influence is measured in generations, 3 to 5 in their parlance, with a likely vote within the span of 2 generations. Those numbers frightened me because they made the abstract urgent in human terms. Our children's lives, our grandchildren's habits might be the next chapter of the ledger. If there's a certain arithmetic to all this, there is also a human story. The Watcher's models do not reduce us to numbers unless we let them. The story I kept thinking of, the one about a town at dusk and the man who refused to help, was essentially human. That is where responsibility lives, in the small moments of choice, the chance to step forward even when it would be easier to step back, the decision to repair rather than to count how much repair costs. A year after the visitor left, the valley held a community fair. It was a small thing, a folding table with chili and a live band that played country covers. I sat on a log and watched people fold themselves into the pattern of communal life. At one point, the band played a slow tune I knew, and I found myself thinking of the visitor's final impression that had been less a prediction than a hope. You have been seen. You have been recorded. There is time.
On the way home that night, I walked slower than usual and thought about the letter I had left in the town years before and what it meant to return, not as a dramatic conversion, but as a simple re-entry. The decisions I had made, the small ones, had no guarantee of altering the world beyond my valley, but they did alter my world. They made my days less like a ledger kept by an outside intelligence and more like a life stitched into a neighborhood. What will they record about you? I ask that not as an accusation, but as a question to set a lantern on the path. Do you go through your day fitting the parts that are easy and letting the rest fray? Do you answer the door when someone asks for help? Do you write the note you keep meaning to write? The visitor taught me that being watched reveals the choices you make in private. The Watchers taught me that private choices, aggregated, look a lot like politics, like culture, like destiny. If this story has touched something in you, an urge to let your private habits match your public convictions, I have put together a small ebook with practices that helped me reconnect the private life to the public good. Simple habits, questions for reflection, and exercises for building the muscle of showing up. It's a modest thing, not a panacea, but it is a toolkit I wished I had when the visitor first came to my door. If you want it, the link is in the pinned comment and the description. It's free, and no promises come with it beyond my hope that it will help you name small acts as acts of care. I do not pretend to know what the Watchers will decide. I only know what it felt like to be observed and then to change. I know that the visitor, wounded and strange, taught me more than one might expect, that observation can be an opportunity to become better, that mutuality, where Watcher and watched both alter, complicates the ease of ruling, and that the time frames the Watchers use do not remove the urgency of this present day. If in the months and years ahead there is a vote, if the Watchers gather and deliberate and act, I can only hope it will be a decision shaped as much by our small decencies as by the cold calculus of models. That seems the only humane course. If a species is to be judged, let it be judged on the weight of its habits as much as on its headlines. I cannot prove any of this beyond my own testimony.
I do not present blueprints for cosmic politics or a dossier of evidence. What I offer is an old man's account of being seen and of choosing to be less invisible in consequence. If nothing else, treat it as a parable with a practical core. Small acts aggregate. Private choices matter. Solitude is not a shield from responsibility. On the mornings now, when the ridge throws its long shadow and the stove hisses like an old friend, I find myself thinking of the visitor more as a teacher than as a curiosity.
I think of the 3 fingers on my palm and the small impression that stayed with me. You matter because you choose. The watchers may decide in their time what to do. I do not know whether they will take the path of restraint or of intervention. I only know the path in front of me. Show up, tend, repair, answer the call when it comes. If this story stirred something, if it made you examine a quiet corner of your life, and you feel ready to build the habit of showing up, to practice the small acts that add up, consider the resources I mentioned. There is the ebook in the pinned comment for those who want short, practical steps. And if you want to work more closely with someone who has tried to translate private character into public action, I offer private sessions. They are not a cure or a fast lane to virtue. They are opportunities to work through the habits that make presence reliable. Links are in the pinned comment and the description. No guarantees, only invitations. In the end, the last warning the visitor left me was not a threat, but a question. How will you be counted? When the watchers gather, when voices speak and votes are cast, what will the ledger show? I cannot walk into the room where those 1,200 minds argue. I cannot charm their numbers. I can only change the small ledger of my own life. So I ask you, as a man who found himself watched in a mountain cabin, what will they record about you?